Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight to the Lurie Garden Design Team panel discussion. Tonight, we're going to do something that has never been done in association with Lurie Garden and with the Lurie Garden name. We have the opportunity, and really this is the first time really in the history of the garden where you're looking at a group of individuals who not only really created what we have today as Lurie Garden, but then also maintain and make Lurie Garden happen every day. And we're going to learn a little bit about the history of that, and we'll learn a bit about how the garden works today and talk a little bit about the future of Lurie Garden as well. Before we get started, though, I do want to introduce myself. I'm Scott Stewart. I'm director of Lurie Garden. And I've been with the garden for 2 years, and it has been, or nearly 2 years, and it has been two of the most magical years of my career at this point. Unfortunately, I don't know if I could ever have a better position than I do now. I get to work with some wonderful people, and I get to have wonderful conversations about the best public garden. There's some of my fellow public garden colleagues in the room, but the best public garden in the world. And I'm glad that you all were able to join us today for a small piece of that. For the first time since the opening of the garden just about 13 years ago, this is the first time that we've had all the key designers as well as the horticulturalists of the garden together for the first time to discuss the creation and operation of Lurie Garden. Now, we at Lurie Garden are very lucky as an organization. We're very thankful for the support that the City of Chicago and the wonderful people of Chicago have provided. In particular, the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Foundation, the Millennium Park Foundation, numerous supporters within the horticultural industry, most of which you see represented in one way or another on the stage tonight, as well as our wonderful and amazing volunteer groups, and a number of other generous supporters that help the garden operate. Without these organizations, or I should say these organizations and individuals enable Lurie Garden to offer over 75 free public education programs each year and host events that are truly unique and truly special, like tonight's panel discussion. So we'll have an opportunity tonight to engage in a conversation that I think will help set the tone for the next 10 or so years of Lurie Garden, and it will really help formulate, really help encapsulate and formulate the future of what Lurie Garden is all about. I want to first start with Laura Ekasetya. Laura is our head horticulturalist at Lurie Garden. She has been with the garden since 2011. Laura is both my right and my left hand in many ways at Lurie Garden. She is the one that makes Lurie Garden happen and the beauty and the excitement of Lurie Garden happen every single day. Without her talents, without her skills, there is no way Lurie Garden, please. There's no way Lurie Garden would look and would function the way that it does today. Then we have Piet Oudolf. We all know Piet in one way or another. Piet is renowned for his philosophy, his approach to landscape design as it's encapsulated in Lurie Garden, as well as a number of other botanical gardens, public gardens throughout this country. We actually have another one of those gardens represented here in the room tonight at Delaware Botanical Garden, where one of Piet's newest installations will be going in very soon, and it will be a true treasure for Delaware as well as the United States to have yet another Piet Oudolf garden in this country. And then we have Shannon Nichol. Shannon is the founding principal, a founding principal of Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichol. Shannon is widely recognized for her designs as being really deeply embedded in the neighborhoods that they exist in, within the communities and the natural contexts in which they exist. Shannon is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and is an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects, and was one of the principal landscape architects behind the vision of Lurie Garden. And certainly not the least, but the last tonight, is Roy Diblik. Roy's the owner of Northwind Perennial Farms. Roy has over 35 years of knowledge in growing traditional and Midwest native perennials, really specializing in highly aesthetic and sustainable plant communities and designing with those plant communities. He believes very strongly that gardens should be both thoughtful as well as ecologically directed and emotionally outreaching and in a very personal context. Roy and Northwind Perennial were instrumental in most of the plant material that you see and that you experience at Lurie Garden. And tonight I'm sure he'll share a few stories about some of that plant material as well as his other experiences in developing Lurie Garden. Okay, and as I had mentioned, I have a few prepared questions for the panelists tonight, and hopefully we'll start off by sharing a few stories, personal stories about Lurie Garden and our interactions in the garden. And we will have time at the end of tonight's conversation for some audience question and answer as well. Piet, I'd like to start with you. Your design style is very closely tied to your personality, to your life experiences. Could you tell us a little bit about your attitude and your design practices, and particularly how they've changed over the years, really since your very first garden to gardens that you're thinking of today?
Good evening. I started, of course, very late in horticulture. I became passionate by plants, and we decided to just study, go back to a study, let's say, and I have to start, but I started a small design office in the west part of the Netherlands with the emphasis on planting. So, of course, construction gardens was part of it, so designing small gardens, private gardens was, of course, part of it, but the plants were where I emphasized on. So they became so important for my work that we decided to move to another place in the eastern part of the Netherlands. That was, we bought a derelict farmhouse, and I was so, let's say, we had enough work in Haarlem, but we wanted to grow plants for our projects because it was hard to get hold of the number of plants we used. So you could say, okay, we could get some plants here, the other plants were in Boskoop, which is 50 miles from our house, then the other plants I had to order 60 miles another direction. So I thought we're going to grow them ourselves. And I was so full of it from the idea that we sold our house, and I had just 50,000 guilders at that time. That's maybe it's $25,000. No, 50,000. Yeah. Nowadays, and I thought, okay, we can live 1 year from that, and so that is, we bought a farmhouse, and I had, what I said, is $25,000 to live a year and to build up the nursery. So that is, and then I realized we came there was so much work. I think I suddenly realized I need someone else, and because we made nice small gardens, and they were already published at that time. That was in the 70s. So I was asked by a magazine to be in a panel at night on a telephone, and opposite of me there was a person. He just came back from England. He worked for Great Dixter as head gardener. So during the evening, with all these questions on the telephone, I asked him to become my partner. It just came up. So I said, okay, we had this conversation, and I said, don't you want to come to Hummelo, where we live? I knew he was single, and he just came back. He was looking for work and another job. So he said yes. So he came and lived in one part of our farmhouse. We were renovating. I built it up. I did all the work on the nursery and the house, and And he had a good name because he came from one of the most famous gardens in England, and he had the connections, and he was a writer, so he could write for one of our best newspapers. So, not that it was income, but at least it pulled people to our place. And so from one came the other. The nursery came there, the house was ready, but I had no design clients. So because who wanted me? You know, if you live in the, at that time, and maybe now they ask me from other places further from house than at that time, but I know that time no one that lived further than 40 miles would ever call me for a design, huh? Because it was so far away, it would cost so much extra on time, driving and so on. So we had to concentrate on the nursery, and because of my partner, people came over from garden clubs to see what we had. We had a very small range of plants. He wrote a new catalog with the descriptions of the plants, what no nurseries did at that time. No one did descriptions, they just had a list. So that pulled in many other people that became interested in the range of plants we were doing, and yeah, so we struggled on, and with a lot of energy, of course. We just worked day and night and 7 days a week. But yeah, so it started slowly. After 1 year, we were on the break of, you know, we had no money, so it was just but we made it. We could convince the bank that we needed a little bit more, and but after 4 years, then the nursery became well known. People came over. We had such a range of plants from not only Germany, Sweden, and so we visited a lot of nurseries around us and countries, Denmark, Sweden, and also, because he had the connections in England, the most famous nurseries we could go to, we just became friends, and we could get all the plants we liked. So our variety of plants became very interesting for garden clubs, people that had gardens, because and also people from abroad. So the English people, nurserymen came to Holland to see what we had collected in the rest of Europe, and. So the people from the nurserymen from Germany and whatever, they come to see what we had from England. So it was a sort of in-between point where people could find the things that they couldn't find anywhere else. So that was sort of, and then after 4 years we broke up. My partner was, had a different idea, so I had to. Unluckily, I had sold him a piece of our land, so I had this big struggle. I had to pay him, so I had to go to the bank again and just had to start all over financially. And but the nursery was there and the clients were there. Anja, my wife, took over the nursery and the responsibility for the communication, did everything I couldn't do. And then it was, I think, we came to Hummelo, where we live, in '82. So '86 we split up, and then in the meantime we had a name. So traveling around Europe, we met other people with the same interest in perennials, the same interest in a sort of perennials. Our perennials were not conventional. They were all mainly taller than the garden center plants, which were sort of this tall. Mostly alpines and plants that you could carry home. And we collected plants that were this tall, didn't flower the first year, so all plants that we could use for landscaping, but they were not commercial. So that was in the, and because we had this, we had this nursery and we became known, a publisher came and asked if we could do a book. And a book about the plants we were selling, more or less, that we could sort of, a written book about the plants, a sort of luxury catalog, but then in book form. And we said yes. So, and then I'm not a writer, and but the people we knew and the friends we had were. One of them, Henk Gers, who was a very creative and a writer and plantsman. So our first book was called Dream Plants, a new generation of garden plants. That was in 1990. And if we look back at the plants that were exposed in the book, most of them we still use in gardens. So it was a different range of plants. And I think that is how it all started. I started to design again. People asked me for my plant to create a border or a small garden where plants were important, because we were totally embedded in the world of plants people. Huh? And that is more or less the beginning of where it all went on. So my first public garden, 1996 in Sweden. Because of the book, the book was seen by some people from the university in Alnarp in South Sweden, and they saw the pictures, saw the plants, and they didn't know the text, but they came to our nursery and said, "Can we translate that into Sweden?" And so on and so on. But is that enough for now?
That's wonderful. This whole
it's 1990 now, huh?
Every one of these panelists we could just give a microphone to, and we'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 hours worth of discussions each. Thank you, Piet. That's wonderful. Thank you. Shannon, my next question is for you. You visited the Lurie Garden team this last winter. A chance for us to all just sort of connect and to catch up about the garden. And I distinctly remember hearing a story about when GGN received a fax, if everyone remembers what a fax is, received a fax notifying GGN about the commission of Lurie Garden, being awarded that commission. Describe that moment for us a little bit. That had to be a truly exciting moment in your personal life as well as GGN.
That fax is... we actually tried to find it earlier this year, and we were distressed because we couldn't find it. It was on yellow paper. So the fax was actually inviting us to submit for the competition, but we acted as excited as if we'd just gotten a commission because we were so excited to have even been considered on the list that the Millennium Park organization had curated of these invited designers, which included Piet Oudolf's name on the list, to submit for this competition. And at first we honestly were sort of, did we get this by mistake? Do they know it's us? Do they know that we just started an office 3 months ago and we're sitting on upside down IKEA garbage cans in our conference room? It's, sort of a similar frame of reference to some of the things that Piet was just talking about, in that we had just, each put in $5,000 to start the office, and I did it on a credit card to tell you kind of where we were. But we were living and breathing the freedom and excitement of starting the office and of being able to really focus on our projects and on design. And so when we received this fax, it said this project called Monroe Garden at the time would be a world-class botanical garden that would include rare and unusual plants that could only be found in Chicago. And so we immediately were intrigued. We were crazy because none of us had been to Chicago. This is horrifying when I relay this, like that we thought we could take this on. None of us had been to Chicago. We didn't have very many other projects, so had all the time in the world, and I was 25 at the time, so could stay up all night reading every book I could get my hands on about Chicago and its history and landscape. But when we saw the part about botanical garden, we kept fixating on that. It was like a 3-sentence description, and we knew that we didn't have the capacity, the expertise, and the focus on purely plants to contribute something that would really fulfill Chicago's high expectations. I mean, Millennium Park everything was mind-blowingly new and unprecedented. And so we started talking about people who were doing that in the world. And Piet Oudolf's name, of course, came up. We had your book. And Catherine said, oh, I just met him a couple of months ago. My business partner, Catherine, had just met him a couple of months ago somewhere in England. And so we used that as a brazen gateway to call him and ask if you would be on the same team as us. And for some crazy reason, you agreed to team with us.
I told Ed earlier I can't come. I cannot submit on this competition because I see at least 2 landscape architects I cannot beat. And then next to that I said, but I can beat them all on the planting.
It's true.
And then he said, why don't you team up, And
yeah. If you can't beat him, join him. We couldn't beat him, so we joined with him. So yeah, the facts started it all. We still sometimes wonder how we were so lucky to be invited into the competition. And design competitions people talk about them a lot as sometimes they're controversial because they require designers to put a lot of extra effort. Some of it's paid, but sometimes there's a lot of free work that goes on. And but the good thing that's inarguably good about design competitions is that they give firms that are on the brink of opportunity and just need a platform and they're willing to put the extra time and energy in. That's definitely the point we were at that point. We threw ourselves into this for a month and a half full time. And they give a platform for young firms to kind of get that first major commission. And they also encourage creative teaming because the third person who joined our team in response to that fax wasn't on the list because he was a theater set designer, Robert Israel out of LA. And he took on the role of being we call him our conceptual reviewer, but he would just be part of our brainstorms and kind of help keep the garden weird and intense and dramatic. And so that's how our team came together.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Shannon. That's terrific. That's, go ahead. Please. So the last few days have been really, truly magical for myself as well as most of the garden staff because with the exception of Laura, this is the first time most of the garden staff has had a chance to interact with Piet and with Shannon and with Roy in the context of reviewing and looking at Lurie Garden in a critical and sort of the next evolution of the garden sense. And so this has been a truly magical, every story that I hear, I then immediately think, I wish I would have recorded that. I wish I would have written that down because it's just wonderful stories that really express the personality that is now Lurie Garden. So absolutely, thank you. Roy, our next question is for you here. This is, and I did hear a bit of a preview of this answer already. So, but you have to tell us tell us about the first time meeting Piet. How did you end up connecting with Piet and this wonderful, phenomenal, and magical association that you have now with Piet?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to. Oh, okay. Yeah, I feel like Vic Damone here with with this microphone. I think he's still alive. I think Vic Damone is still alive in New York. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to come here and discuss one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. And I met Piet first through his books. A friend of ours, Gary, who sells plants out of Holland, he threw Gardening with Grasses in the front seat of my pickup truck at Northwind. He'd just come to visit. And he said, Roy, I threw a book in your truck. Take a look at it. So I looked through the truck window and I saw Gardening with Grasses. I said, whoopee, it's another gardening book, A through Z on grasses. They're coming out of, I didn't really pay attention to it. So I went home that night after work, after I went home, I took the book in the house. So as I was eating, I thumbed through the book. And right now, even telling you this story, I get goosebumps. I've never seen a book as beautiful as Gardening with Grasses in my life, because it wasn't a book about plants A to Z. It was a book on plants in loving relationships and communities. It was a book on grasses living with other herbaceous plants in healthy systems. And I'm sitting there reading it, and I go, who's this Piet Oudolf or Oudolf? I've never heard of him. And I realized he's here. The moment for plants living in healthy communities is finally here. We've had people talking about prairies, but the thing that the prairie people lack is sometimes they don't think about aesthetics. They look at the health and well-being of all the other creatures that visit prairies. But Piet's book, and again, it's looking at healthy relationships of, and this is the beauty of it, native and non-native plants living healthy and harmoniously together. So when I saw that book, I took it to Midwest Ground Covers, because at the time I was growing 400,000 perennials a year for Midwest Ground Covers. I got them into perennials. And I showed them, I said, the times are changing. We're not going to be putting herbaceous plants, and we're not going to treat them like annuals anymore. We're not going to put them in mass groups so they can self-destruct and die. There's no more monoculture planting in our future. And it was Piet's book. And then another book came out. So I got the second book, the design book came out. Yeah, Designing with Plants. And that was even more exciting. And then around in 2001, July of 2001, it was the same thing. I got a fax. And there's the fax. It says, Piet Oudolf, I'd like to come and visit you at your nursery, and I'm bringing a friend of mine, John Cook, came with you? Yeah.
Cook, yes.
So I'm looking at this fax, and I thought, this is April Fool's. This can't be real. I got a fax from Piet Oudolf is coming to see me at Northwind. So from then until September, I was never more excited in my life. Because I've been growing perennials since 1978. And to be fair, I don't have a degree. I never took a horticultural class in my life. I'm an outdoor education teacher. In the 70s, I worked with kids at Cabrini Green. That's what I did, and I love that work. I took them out to Camp Reinberg for 2 weeks. So I was never planning on being a gardener. And as I started growing perennials and native plants through the 80s, I found that they weren't valued by the average person, really found no value in perennials. They were too busy looking at annuals as entertainment and putting in spireas and dahlias and wood chipping the rest of the earth, thinking that was beauty. So when Piet showed up that day, he unrolled the Lurie Garden plan in the potting shed, and I could see every plant come off that plan. And I just like right now, just telling you this story, I saw the most beautiful garden I've ever seen in my life. And that was the day we met, and I think after that meeting, I ran into somebody that I could actually talk about plants with for 2 to 3 hours that wasn't looking at their watch trying to get the hell out of here. So it was just a wonderful first meeting, and then it was an opportunity to work with you guys, to work with them on the light, when we met at the lighting store coming into Chicago again and discussing the soil, the irrigation. It was just a beautiful moment. And I've never been happier in my life to be involved with a project than the Lurie Garden. It helped me in so many ways try to see that these plants that I've been growing since 1978, every plant I've grown, they finally have patiently waited. All these plants have patiently waited for their opportunity to show what they could do. And here they are in Michigan Avenue, just rocking and rolling. So I'm just very excited, and the relationship, I think, with Piet, with everybody involved, has grown into something very special for me. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much. Laura, I'd curious, you're going on being the head horticulturist of Lurie Garden at this point, going on 6 years or so now. By far, Laura in the office and the garden has the most experience of all of us with Lurie Garden. And Lurie Garden is, as you've probably already picked up on, is not your typical garden. It's not your average garden. And so it takes a very special and talented individual to see that and to get inside the head of all of these people up here. And so you've had 6 years of experience with that. Tell us a little bit about how maintaining the garden, working with everyone here, how's that changed you as a horticultural professional? How's that changed your vision of horticulture?
I think this style of gardening, even though I've always loved this garden, I was a regular visitor to this garden before I worked here. I even came to the opening of Millennium Park, and the plants were these tiny 1-gallon plants. People came in the garden, and in the evening it's beautiful to put your feet in the water. The lighting of the water feature was really lovely, but I don't think everyone really appreciated this field of little 1-gallon plants. It takes 2 years for them to grow, for people to really appreciate it. Maybe a true gardener, can envision what would happen. But when I started here, it's obviously a fully grown garden at that point, and I was used to maybe having plants be further apart from each other and mulch in between them, and I always connected to the beauty of this garden, perhaps on a more elemental level, without realizing how wild what the soil level is in our garden. And I think that I began to really appreciate that in the first year, really in the first few weeks of working in the garden. But then when visitors would come through, they would say things to me like, "Oh, is this a wildflower garden? You know, the plants just happened here," and I'm like, no, this was all intended, and I have to weed it, and sometimes the plants grow out of their bounds, and I contain them, and I realized that having plants grow, as Roy mentioned, in communities and closer together and intermingled, was something, especially then, a little bit different from what people were used to seeing. And I think over time, while I still have that conversation with visitors in the garden, I really get less of that as a reaction. And I think this garden has sort of set a precedent in this area and perhaps in other parts of the country for this style of gardening, which is really not only, I think, a more beautiful way to garden, but it supports the local ecology in a way that more traditional gardening practices do so. So, and one thing that surprises me really every day, especially, this is the best time of year for this, is just all of the insect life that the plants attract. And people come into the garden and are sometimes afraid of that, and you have to kind of explain it to them. And others are just really interested in that. But definitely there's no other garden I've worked in before that has such a variety of birds and insects that is supported by a truly cultivated garden.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Thank you. So my next question, I'd like to get responses from each of you on. But for each of you represent a different area, a different field, a different area of specialty in sort of the broader horticultural world. I'd like to hear from all of you a little on how do you feel Lurie Garden as it exists today, as it existed 13 years ago in its creation. How has Lurie Garden changed the garden design field? How has that impacted the design field? Roy, we'll start with you on that.
Excuse me. I think that's a terrific question, because it, excuse me again, it has changed the design. You can't make up how dramatic the change is. Because at first, when Lurie Garden went in, and this is just a overall thought, many of the landscape architects in the area, the suburban area, were critical of it. They thought it was too eclectic, they were too messy, no one would ever buy into it. But the reason they criticized it like that in a harsh way simply because they didn't know how to do it. Most of the design people, landscape architects, they don't know anything about plants. So when you go around and you look at what's being designed and put in, it's monocultures are the simplest things to use. And when you look at the care and maintenance and the cost of taking care of a monoculture planting, you look at the wood chips brought in, the amount of mulching, and most of the contractors, they make a living not on the plants they put in the ground, they make a living by selling you mulch. So we're not a plant-driven culture. And when the Lurie Garden got put in, you're looking at plants living in healthy, vibrant communities. And when people started to walk through there, one thing I noticed was you see two businessmen walking together talking about some big deal so they can make a couple more bucks. They're walking through the hedge. And when you see them walk through that hedge and get into the garden, these two people talking about serious things, seemingly, all of a sudden they would look around and you think they landed in Oz. They had no idea what they were seeing or what was going on around them. And a beautiful thing, I think, that Laura mentioned is when you look at the activity of the insects and the birds and the butterflies, you see all of that bringing the garden to a higher level of health. And when I got involved with it, with Piet and trying to locate and find the plants, the key objective that my goal was no substitutions. Whatever Piet put in that design, I had to make sure was 28,000 plants were sitting there that are the plants he wanted. Because the minute you substitute, that's like saying, you know what, I ran out of eggs for the cake, I'll just throw in some walnuts instead. In the United States, we freely substitute any plant we can't find with any other plant. And we don't have gardens being developed, we have eclectic messes. So a lot of the contractors out there simply are just keeping bad from getting worse. We're not America the Beautiful. We're America the land of neat and tidy. And when you look at the Lurie Garden and what that represents, that's our future to becoming America the Beautiful. And it's being practiced now by more landscape designers and architects in the last 10 years than ever before. I thought about it. Tremendous impact that garden's made. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Roy. Laura, how about you? How do you think that the Lurie Garden, particularly from your perspective on maintenance management, how has it changed the design field? How has it changed the horticultural field?
Well, people are actually interested in very basic things that we do that I forget are maybe different or something. And for example, we cut the garden back late winter. We like to do it on a nice frozen day when the soil's still crunchy at top before the bulbs come up. And we just use a brush mower. And we're not cutting the plants down, at the end of the fall. And people like to come and watch that happen, and I think that's kind of fun. In fact, our media relations folks really want to promote that, but we can't tell them what day that's going to happen well in advance. It's all about the season and nature. We can't schedule that necessarily. It depends on what the weather is going to be and if there's too much snow or things like that. So people are really interested in little basic things like that. Working out in the garden, I don't necessarily deadhead most things. Sometimes I do. If something doesn't look good, I will cut the flower off, maybe get a rebloom or so. But for the most part, many seed heads are left up in the garden. And I do find that that's becoming more accepted by many other gardeners. But people who are not a gardener, you have to kind of explain that to them sometimes. But they realize that's beautiful. Like they can connect with it, but they just don't. They want to ask you a question about it. And I think that our style of gardening has definitely influenced the kind of aesthetics of other gardens in the area. I've noticed more natural plantings around in containers and things like that in some of the medians to the south of us. But that's something that I think has just changed in the 5 or so years that I've worked here. I definitely get more questions in this garden about what I'm doing than anywhere I've ever worked in my life.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Shannon, how about from your perspective, from particularly the landscape architecture perspective, how do you feel Lurie Garden has impacted design?
Well, I received similar feedback from some of my peers before it was completed and people saw the images, and even after, for the first few years, that it was strange looking. The people couldn't get their heads wrapped around what kind and style of garden it was and what kind of landscape it was. And the reason why it's weird is because it's telling the story of one very unique site that evolved from being part of the lake to being filled in with rubble from the Great Fire to being part of the railroad, a 5-story parking garage with a botanical garden on top that's part of this incredible park. It's an outrageous story, but Chicago built itself up in a similar way, just amazing. So that story to us was so distinctive and unique, and that site is so unique, that it just led us to push this concept of plants being this really thick, muscular mass, as opposed to simply framing a space or being something that you walk around on like a lawn, and not being specimens that you look at, but just being this very strong, controlling, immersive experience, this solid. And the way to make that happen was sort of, as we, the drawings that you see on the screen were just sort of all of our blind wanderings where we weren't really replicating anything, but we were trying to articulate that together into this assembly of a hedge that would let you in and keep you in suspense until you saw the magical central landscape that had Piet's mind-blowing combinations of perennials and all the other parts of the garden. And I think the point that I wanted to make is that in retrospect now it seems obvious that a garden should be about the city, and cities are beautiful. Chicago is beautiful. The garden is set up to frame that beautiful view of one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and to be unique to city life here. I think now it's a good thing, we've started to take for granted that cities are beautiful, they're healthy, it's healthy and desirable to live in a city, and that the city and what we call nature, but plants and the experience of the outdoors can go together more potently and more beautifully than anyone had been thinking for at least a few generations before that, where there was a fixation on separating nature and cities. So that idea has become very popular in landscape architecture now, which is a good thing. People say, well, of course, urbanism and the best landscapes can be at the foot of high rises, and it's all part of a great city. But the Lurie Garden, I think we were part of something that we didn't realize it at the time, but would set a confident precedent that made other cities more confident and other landscape architects more confident in celebrating the urban qualities of their site and the real urban stories of their urban sites, as opposed to only referencing nature.
Excellent.
Sorry for rambling.
Excellent. Thank you, Shannon. Piet, from your perspective, how has Lurie Garden impacted garden design?
It's difficult to say. It's a growing matter. Huh? You start with an idea. You start with it grows by itself, by your belief in what you do. I think that is what it is, and that is what happened. Believing in what you do and think that it is more beautiful than you've seen in other plantings or whatever. I always had the idea that I could express my inner emotion with plants. So that is why it all started. So I thought the plants are, this is so great. I could do this, and with that plant I can do that, and with all these plants I can do something so great that was my sort of the feeling I had. I connected so much with plants, not only with an individual, not only with the mass, but also with an individual. I thought, really, it's strange. I'm very sober and very I'm very realistic. But when I see plants, it is if I see a human being, a person, a character, someone I can not talk to, but there's a connection. I think that is always what led me to what I do now. And I thought, looking at traditional gardening, was more, I found out about decoration, putting beautiful plants together, and then 3 beautiful plants made a beautiful combination. But for me, it's not about beautiful plants, it's about communities. And I think if you put 100 beautiful people together, I think you would walk away if you were a little bit less beautiful. And I think a good community is about people with character and people that can talk to each other, people that like each other, and after a while they really don't want to leave each other. And that, I think that is, I transform my ideas from what you are as a person to what I do in gardens. I think that is more or less the essence why I could do what I do and still do what I do and still see the force and the emotion you can bring in your work. And then I just want to give them a compliment, because to work in the context of great architecture is of course the best you can do. I could do a planting that can be emotional, can be great, nothing around it, maybe a few trees would work too, but to work in the city, you cannot only have the city as context. You need a good architect or landscape architect to work with to emphasize your own beautiful piece in that context. So that is more or less. Was that a question? No.
I'll take it anyway.
This was the story.
I think that's fine with everybody in the room. So,
no, but in a way, by just being focused and always thought, okay, this is beautiful, and being able to work in public space, I discovered that, of course, I kept on working for private gardens and make them beautiful, and all the families were happy, and the children would run to your plants, and after 5 years there was nothing left, and some gardens were probably would stay good. But I think I noticed working in public space, millions of people come through your plants. There's always a few that have never. There are many that have never seen that. In cities, not everyone has a garden, so you make people aware of of something they have in them that they have never found. And that's why people stop and look and think, this is something, what is this, And they start thinking, they start looking and questioning, because it's not common to see things like this. If I say, call me a city where you have a garden like the Lurie Garden, there might be a few, one at least, but not many more. And I think that is so satisfying. So I think there should be more money for places like this. Even if I know there's never money, there's no money, but there's always money, and there should be some money for good places that with plants.
excellent. Thank you, Pete. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Please. So I have one question about the future of Lurie Garden and your perspectives on the future of Lurie Garden. And as the garden really enters its 13th year as the sort of iconic garden here in Chicago, I'm curious to hear about your perspectives on what you think the future for Lurie Garden may look like. How it may evolve, how maybe you might like to see it evolve. That's been much of the nature of the conversation that we've all had over the last several days. As we've all walked the garden, we've discussed, we've taken pictures, we've compared pictures from previous visits and previous times in the garden, and a lot of conversation about evolution and change in the garden. So I'd like to start with Laura and hear a little about what you feel the future of Lurie Garden, the future impact, the future evolution may be.
Well, the garden is going to change over time. Perhaps climate will change. Some of the plants may do much better and become more aggressive than in past years, and others might not do as well. But we just adapt every year to things like that. I think that it's not about sticking to a map of the garden and keeping it exactly that way forever. I think you look at what's working out. We can consult with Piet and walk around in the garden, but he's not always going to be available in the future to do that. I won't always be here and available to do that. So there has to be a way to pass this style of gardening and what this garden is, what about this garden looks the best and is most interesting. It needs to be sort of passed on to future people. So I think writing a bit about what we do, taking good photographs, things like that to kind of explain it, I think that is the best way to keep the garden from, say, 10 years from now, if there's someone taking care of it that lets certain things sort of seed. Like if you just walked away and didn't work in the garden for a year, about 3 plants would take over. Maybe eventually one of those would win. I don't know, but it would look much different. It wouldn't be, as inspiring to walk and look at. And so I think I think that the future is bright for the garden. I just don't think we're fortunate to have an endowment from Anne Lurie, so hopefully that will be available to us to continue to maintain the garden and maintain the hardscape and so forth. But I think the future of the garden is really in the vision of the people working there to continue to let it evolve. And it's not so stagnant. If we need to take out a tree and try something else that works better, that's no problem. You don't have to. Each individual plant isn't so precious that you don't need to hoard it. We're not a hoarder's garden. So, but it is about the general feeling that you get when you look at it, and so that needs to be sort of passed on through time. But I've been updating the maps lately, and it's really not about keeping it that way for the rest of my life. It will change. There's always new plants to try. We get excited about that, especially.
But I think that also we should talk about a perennial planting has a lifespan. You cannot say it's an oak tree. It doesn't live for 500 years. So you need to know that this is a perennial planting that changes, and plants die. You have to replant. That happens in nature as well. So we cannot, think that this garden would live forever. So you need to think about renewing all the time. And that's what we do, in fact. But you shouldn't see it as that, plants are dying. Maybe that's the wrong plant. No, it's not the wrong plant. The plant did its best for 7 years, so why not dying now? Huh? So I think that is how I look at gardening. It's a constant process of coming and going. And for a tree, it's sometimes 100 or 500 years. For a perennial, it's between 5 and 10, 15 years, and that's what it is. So. And that's how I think of gardens.
Absolutely. Beautiful way of saying that. Shannon, how about from your perspective, future of Lurie Garden?
Well, I suppose one part of it is a wish that the bone structure is strong and clear enough that it can handle a fair amount of change with the aspects of the garden that are designed to change and are more dynamic. It's sometimes can be an overlooked component of a great garden, is this sort of boring underpinnings of what the landform is, the proportions, and the framing of all the dynamic stuff that happens. And you kind of want that bone structure to be self-evident, so even if you're not there to explain why there's a weird L-shaped hedge there, or a boardwalk slashing diagonally through the middle, that there'll always be this intuition about this contrast between the two plates, and people will feel confident having change happen because the whole garden won't look like it's ripped apart or falling apart. I think the future of the Lurie Garden, I'm already seeing it happen with a lot of the cities we work with. It's brought up constantly because thank goodness that Chicago was brave enough to put in a public garden like this on a rooftop. So there's multiple precedents that are happening, both management-wise, use-wise, technically. And because it was so ahead of the curve, it's now becoming an unparalleled resource model that is emboldening people to say, okay, we either do or we don't have that much money to do this, but at least we know what, we know that it can happen, and here's what is involved, here's what worked and didn't work. So I see the garden becoming more and more of a central resource for urban landscapes in the way that urban public space needs to evolve: richer, denser, less pavement, more plants, and of course more advanced practices in management. High-use garden. There's so much pressure to put more paving and less plants in, to be overly conservative, and the Lurie Garden has proven that with intense management and very rich talent involved, as well as generous funding, it is possible, and it's possible to define what's needed to make it work.
Roy, we'll wrap up this portion with the question about future with you.
I go back to my roots of evolution is education. And I think when I think about the Lurie Garden, its future is the things you're doing right now, the intents in developing programs to bring people into the garden, to expand its awareness, its use, its plant diversity. So I think when you look at the educational part of the garden, and not in big ways, but to the little people, the family that comes from Berwyn, the family that comes from Cicero that wanders through, they don't know what they're seeing. But here you're putting on these wonderful programs, and you're talking about how the plants live together, work together, insects, pollinators. I put a street planting in West Union, Iowa. They know about the Lurie Garden. I'm working in East Troy, Wisconsin. They know about the Lurie Garden. This garden is not just in Chicago, it's all over the Midwest. And I think when you come to know the reach you have and how deep you're working into the fabric of the Midwestern mind, this is a strong place. And when you realize that, I think by your programming, what you're doing now, you're going to continue to strengthen the reach of the Lurie Garden. And it just brings nothing but joy and happiness. And it's to the homeowners. The family in the bungalow in Berwyn. They're trying, I see them stuffing ornamental grasses into their lawn, as they saw it at the Lurie Garden. They're taking plants that they never would have done before. They're trying to see how they can make the Lurie Garden part of their backyard. So this is a tremendous, and I think the more programming you do, like in the direction you're at, that's a bright future, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. So with that, those were just a little snapshot, a little moment in time of the history, the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day ongoings, and a bit of the future of Lurie Garden from the people that really created this truly magical, truly special place in Chicago, and the people that make that place happen day in and day out. With that, I would like to open the floor up for some audience questions and answers. And I didn't even get the sentence out of my mouth that I had a hand up. Terrific. I love that. Yes, ma'am.
My question is kind of twofold, but both Pete answered. I like the Northwind. I really love this place. It has a variety of just different plants and grasses and everything. I'm wondering, do you cross, because he's so far away, the variety of things, I don't always see just natives that are native to the Midwest in the Lurie Garden, and way more of these native, not non-native for the Midwest in Northwind. Do you all collaborate? Do you all exchange seeds? How one gets seeds from there? The documentary last night was just so profound for me, especially about the way the seasons change and how our life perspectives are so entwined with those as far as living and giving. And I'd just like to have a little bit more explanation, because it doesn't always mean color in terms of transitioning from one season to the other. It really is a lifetime of overall transition. And you can kind of see where deadness is not always deadness. It actually does have some variety. But I'm really interested in terms of it because I see grasses at Northwind that I don't see anywhere else on this part of it.
So I can answer the question about seed and plant material. So Lurie Garden uses a small, very select group of reasonably local growers to supply plant material. We started that way. That was a philosophy that really underpins Lurie Garden, a small select group of growers for a small or a diverse but select group of plant materials. And that tradition continues to today, where we use the garden and as plants evolve and change in the garden and we see different structures, different textures, different elements of the plants evolving, we do our best to share that plant material with some of those growers so that they can introduce that into the horticultural world, into the marketplace, as well as, and I selfishly will say more importantly, grow that plant material back for us as well. So we often will share with Roy at Northwind, as well as several other small growers in the area, seeds and plant materials and so forth, so that the plant material that you see in Lurie Garden finds its way back into the nursery trade, so that it can find its way back into your landscapes at home. And your second question I thought was very interesting with regards to transitions in the Lurie Garden. And please, I'd love to hear some thoughts about the importance of Lurie Garden in expressing the sense of transition, seasonality, change over long periods of time, change from year to year. Piet, let's start with you about transitions in Lurie Garden.
In what sense? The seasonality, or?
In the sense of seasonality and the changing of the plant material.
Okay, yeah. Of course, we start with a fixed plan, where the plants are grouped as I think that they should perform. But through the years, you notice that plants want to move, and some plants don't want to do what you expect. So that is when we start changing our mind about certain species that we probably have to replace. We have sedum that didn't work well and works everywhere but except here. So there's a certain local effect on plants as well. So the microclimate, humidity, anything can just make that the plant doesn't do what you do. So there is, from that moment on, you start changing your design or your basic design, the plan you made. Then next plants grow, and we don't want to bring it back to what it was. So you can, of course, say, okay, this is the plan. We might have to change a few plants that don't perform, but we stick to the plan, and we change the names of the plants that don't do it, and that's it. The other thing is that the garden will never grow. It will always be what you have had on the plan. That will say that the garden will be dated maybe in 10 years' time. You think, okay, is this what we still want as a society in the context of our environment? You know, do we still have to do so much work? And that's why since a few years my mind changed about getting stuck to your plan, and it came through projects like this and the High Line, that we have to work with how things go. We have to, gardening is at the moment, or if you work with a succession of plants, if you plant trees, things you plant underneath, after 5-6 years, they don't do what they want, what they have to do because of the tree becomes too big, and the shade becomes too heavy. So I gave up bringing it all back to the base, the beginning. I started to think of how can we improve the garden or let the garden grow with the moment of need. So if a plant feels happy and it looks good at the place where it grows, we think, and it looks good, it's also an aesthetic thing because we are still gardeners. We're not living in nature, we're living in a city where if people don't appreciate it, people start running to it, throw garbage in it. So the aesthetics for parks is very important. So what we try to do with our landscapes is that we follow the succession and the processes of what plants do. We change plants where necessary, but on the other hand, we guide the plants where they like it and we like them to be, and we see that it looks good, we leave it. That is how we garden today. And that is what and the other thing that is the difficulty, you need good gardeners that to understand that, and not only good gardeners that can weed and see and recognize the weeds. We need gardeners that can also see the process and also can follow those processes that happen in the garden and also have a good eye. So it is a very complex thing. So gardening and things we do in landscape is so complex that you better don't talk about it, just do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Piet.
Scott, I do know that the Chicago Botanic Garden was involved in all of the RFP in terms of being at least consulted and partnered. I think it's very amorphic because at that point the architects hadn't been chosen. And I can't speak for the currency of the garden's role, but I know that very early on there was, when Sophia was head of the garden, and I'm sure that's continued with Jean Francis, that at least there is an overture for partnership.
And I'm sure that any project in Chicago is always a special project, architecture or landscape-wise. And I'm sure that the landscape will be truly Chicago and truly unique, as all landscapes in Chicago really are, and they have that special, very Chicago quality to them. I do hope they come knocking on our door, Laura, and ask us maybe a few questions. I think that would be great if they did. I think took a little lesson from Lurie Garden. I think that would be terrific. Other questions? Yes?
I have a question. I just have a comment. I live in the city, and I've noticed a lot of people are incorporating a lot of the plants that they see in the garden into their own gardens. And you're now seeing a lot of, instead of lawns, you're seeing a lot of gardens in front of homes, which when I was growing up, if your neighbor did that, that was a big no-no. You didn't put flowering gardens in your front. You had lawn. And so I am seeing a lot of that changing. And I think the Lurie Garden has should take a lot of credit for that. I also think the zoo with their Boardwalk garden that kind of followed after the Lurie, and also the Peggy Norbert did a wonderful garden, and that all kind of was after the Lurie Garden. So I think you kind of set a precedent for what's going on, and I think you should be commended for that. It was really beautiful, and I think we're seeing it now in a lot of their areas.
Absolutely. And actually, Roy, I'd like to turn to you a bit with that, with the idea of how much Lurie Garden has influenced other gardens in Chicago, all the way down to individual homeowners in the area and experimenting, as you've mentioned. I know you have very much some firsthand experience at that, having grown plants in a retail setting for so many years. Do you have any comments with that?
I think that's a good observation, because I see that when I drive through, you go to Oak Park, and you see the progressive nature people are taking with their turf areas. They're minimizing turf. I think the question is they're asking a question, how much turf do I really need? Before, turf was just accepted as something you put in, and because it was easy and quick and to take care of, now people are saying, maybe I don't need as much as I have, and they're working all these various styles of plantings, and a lot of times they're not really sure what they're doing. But that's cool. You don't really have to have answers to everything. Sometimes your answers come from your practice, like Piet just said. Just go do it. And after you just go do it, you can start to understand your responsibility and you introduce yourself to the plants, and the plants introduce themselves to you. Here's what we need to have a good life. Are you prepared to give that to us? And as the gardener, you're saying, you know what? I got that hour and a half a week. I'll share my time. So it's an introduction of yourself and your lifestyle, and the plant's introduction to you, saying, look, I don't need, once I'm established, you know what, I can live on average rainfall. I don't need your irrigation system. I can live here, I can live close to your turf, and if turf invades my part of the garden, I can live compatibly with turf. So it's a wonderful learning experience that we all can go through together. But I think still the inspiration, I have to say, comes from Lurie Garden. And it's not to be critical of all the other public parks, but every place, if I go to Chicago Botanic Garden, no offense, Chicago Botanic Garden, but they put there, it's a museum to me. It's like going into the Art Institute. If I go into the Art Institute, I'm never going to get to own a Monet. It's never going to happen in my lifetime. And when I go to the Chicago Botanic Garden, I see a lot of beautiful things there that my sister can't do in Naperville. She doesn't have the money, she doesn't have the labor, she doesn't have the time or the knowledge to duplicate what you see at Chicago Botanic Garden. But Leanne can come out to Lurie Garden and she can walk through here. She can do something from the Lurie Garden at her home in Naperville. So I really think when you relate it, the Lurie Garden relates to all of us in a very beautiful way. And I'm happy to just be sitting here with everybody. Because I never dreamed back in the 1990s, I was just a freak. You know, till I met Piet, people came to Natural Garden or Northwind, and they just thought, well, this is cool, but this will never happen in reality. And then when I met Piet and looked at his design, and the Lurie Garden came to fruition, all of a sudden the plants I was growing for a number of years became popular. And I think the popular notion of these plants is going to continue into our future. So I'm very excited. To tell you, if you come to Northwind right now, I'm actually trying to sell you thistles. I have cerciums on benches in 1-gallon containers. I grow thistles, and I'm wanting you to buy them. I grow 2 native thistles, Cercium discolor and Cercium altissima. Now, there's not another nursery in the Midwest that's going to try to sell you a thistle. And because when you put these thistles in, the first thing you notice, you can grab their foliage. They're user-friendly. And they attract so many wonderful pollinators and birds and butterflies, and they incorporate themselves into the garden in a gentle way. They don't try to take over the garden. They work themselves in a communal way and share space with the other plants you have, if you have the right plants. So it's not just anything. But I just wanted to throw that out there because that's when you come to Northwind, we have more plants that nobody wants than any nursery in the Midwest. That's just a fact. So, and again, it's meeting Piet, working with Shannon, and then working with Laura and Scott here has just been the best part of my life. I really appreciate all the opportunities I've had, so thanks.
I think we may have a new Lurie Garden motto, more plants than no one wants. So, yeah. Excellent. We have time for just one more quick question. Yes, sir?
As the photo montage was going through, I was struck by the overhead shots and how the perspective of the garden changed. You were able to see the plants more delineated and how they fit together. Could elevated platforms be incorporated in the garden so that it would give people that perspective and maybe be a teaching tool as to how to put these plants together?
So in the photo montages, you'll see a number of aerial photos of the garden. These are recent, brand new aerial photos of the garden just from this year. And one of the purposes that we engaged a drone pilot with a camera setup was partially that very thing, was to capture the garden, to use it in teaching about design and plant arrangements and so forth. But I would like, that brings up a very interesting question in, Piet and Shannon, I'd like to hear from both of you from a design perspective. Looking at the garden from above as opposed to walking through the garden and looking at it from a sort of that sort of perspective. What are the differences in teaching people about how Lurie Garden is designed, how the plant communities are put together that may be useful?
Well, my answer may be a little counterintuitive, or coming at it from a different angle, but I found your question really provocative because from the landscape architecture perspective, we're constantly pushing on ourselves to not be thinking about it in the plan view because we work in the plan view to arrange everything, organize everything, give instructions to the contractors to get the proportions right. But we're constantly, I was talking about this on the tours, it's a joke in our office, but we're constantly putting our eyes down, laying our heads down on the drawings so that our eye can get down and see things in perspective, because that's ultimately how people will be experiencing and interacting with the garden. So just an observation that, and then I found that provocative, like, well, we want the plan view. This garden was a bit of an exception for us because we actually did think a lot about the plan view, because a lot of people experience it from a distance, from the upper stories of all those gorgeous buildings along the edge of Grant Park, but also an elevated perspective from the Art Institute. The whole garden is sloped at about a 4% slope to tilt back toward the Art Institute to sort of catch the sun, but also force perspective a little bit, so it almost looks bigger from that wall of glass than it really is, because you're kind of elongating the depth by tilting it and seeing more surface. That's one elevated perspective that certainly isn't at that pure striking plan view of that drone photo, which I reacted to as well. But it was something we were thinking about more than we normally would. We allowed ourselves to indulge in plan view thinking more than normal because of those perspectives. But I'm curious to hear what Piet would think about an elevated platform. Or
It's exactly what you say. We in gardens we walk on this sort of eye level experience, so it's all about perspective and not from. And when we do something like here, that is done by purpose, so that you create some graphic element or some seasonal aspect that shows up in a particular time of the year that you know, but that is done because of the situation where the park is made. But normally you won't do that. But it's not a starting point in design. It's more something you think of when you in the conceptually. Huh?
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for this evening.